Hey, also in the last lesson, we talked about how we can gather a sample in order to collect data, like taking a simple random sample or stratified sample or a cluster sample or a systematic sample or even using a combination of any of them and getting a multi-stage sample. So we talked about the ways that we sample. But of course, there's always some pitfalls that we have to look out for and we have to be cognizant of. And so there's some ways that we can get a bad sample or a sample that's introduced biased into our data that's going to give us some bad information. So we're going to talk about what those methods are and the bias that's introduced. So the first way to sample badly would be to get a voluntary response sample. And I know I see these all the time, especially on Twitter. I follow a lot of sports accounts and they do polls, like who was the man of the match or um, who would you start at quarterback? And these are voluntary response polls. The only people who are seeing them are people who follow those accounts, and the only people who are answering are people who really care about that idea. Um, and so you're not getting a really good representation of maybe everybody. So, like for example, I'm a fan of Arsenal, and so if people who are Arsenal fans don't have Twitter or don't follow certain Arsenal accounts, we're not going to get a representation of those people. And so these types of polls or surveys are invalid. It doesn't matter how big your sample size is because you're still always going to have the bias that only people who see that or choose to go to that website or Twitter account are going to be able to answer. And it introduces bias into our results. So this is a bad way to try and collect uh, data. Another bad method is convenience sampling. I always think about when I go to the mall and people are standing around asking you to do a survey. That's a matter of convenience. If we were to stand in the cafeteria and survey students who walk into the second floor cafeteria, that would be a convenience sample. We wouldn't be getting a representative sample of the population. Um, in the example of standing in the second floor cafeteria, we know that there's a first floor cafeteria, so we'd be missing those students. There are students who don't go to lunch at all because they go to the library or they like to sit and eat in a teacher's classroom. So we're not getting a representation of everybody in the school, especially because where you eat lunch might be based on some sort of important characteristic that we'd be interested in. And so being able to get a good sample is usually not convenient, and so a convenience sample is a bad way to sample. We can also have a bad sampling frame. So the sampling frame is the group of individuals that we are going to sample from to learn something about a population. So when you have a bad sampling frame, it's when you have individuals in the population that we have not considered sampling. So these are examples from the book, like people in prison, people who are homeless, people who are students studying at a university, not in your location. So if we were trying to find something out, let's say about Northern Virginia, we would have people in this area who are incarcerated, people in this area who are homeless, we wouldn't probably reach. We have lots of students who would be traveling out of the area to go to school, and we wouldn't be able to reach them. And so we could have some issues if we aren't cognizant of that and aren't intentional about including those people into our sampling frame. Another thing we need to consider is undercoverage. So I know that sampling frame and undercoverage tend to get a little bit, they run together a bit. And so a bad sampling frame means we haven't considered individuals. Undercoverage means we have not reached you. So this is where some of the people in our population are underrepresented or maybe not represented at all. So the example here is a telephone survey. and we call during dinner time because we hope that most people are home during dinner time and not at work. Um, but of course, we know some people work at night, so we would miss those people. Some people don't eat at home. Some people like to go out to dinner often. And so we're missing those people in our sample. And so if we've selected those people to be sampled, we might be missing out on, again, the people who like to eat dinner at a restaurant, the people who work at night. And again, maybe there's some character trait or something about them that is important to us and we want to have represented in our survey. And I should say it does introduce bias in undercoverage. A specific type of bias that we talk about a lot is non-response bias. So far we've had bad sampling frame where uh, we haven't considered individuals. We've had undercoverage where we haven't been able to reach individuals. So because of the way our study is designed, we haven't been able to get a hold of them. And then we have a non-response, which is where people just don't want to participate. So we've considered them, we've gotten a hold of them, and they said, no, thank you. I would not like to answer this survey. So they're quite literally not responding to the survey. So um, I get a phone call, I answer it and say no thank you, or I hang up. Or I get a letter in the mail with a survey and I throw it out. Or I get an email asking me how was my customer experience and I delete that email. All right, so they've reached me, they've considered me, and I said no thank you. And last would be what's called a response bias. So response bias is when the way I've written a question or the way I've asked a question or maybe even the environment in which I'm asking the question has somehow influenced the response from the person I'm asking that question of. So um, I could say to somebody, do you think smoking is bad? And they could pretty simply come up with their own answer. Or I can say, given that smoking kills this number of people every year because of cancer, do you think smoking is bad? And so in that question, I've sort of led them to the response I want. I've talked about how bad smoking is and for what reasons they're bad, and so it might influence that person to um, answer the way I'd like them to, and that introduces bias. Also, if I were to maybe give you all a survey about how you feel about me as a teacher, and I were to do that uh, in person and make you raise your hand if you didn't like me, there might be some people who aren't willing to answer honestly in that scenario, and so that would introduce a response bias. Of course, some people would answer honestly, and that's fine, but there would be people uncomfortable answering in that scenario. And so the way that I've presented the question has influenced your response, and we get a biased data set. So we've talked about sampling, we've talked about bad sampling. I might have gone a little quickly there. I have no questions for you to answer at the end of this today. But if you have questions for me, make sure you bring them to class so that I can answer them. We can talk about them and do a little bit more on sampling.